Did 19th-century American philosophers directly take up evolution?
Yes. Both John Fiske, 1842–1901, and Chauncey Wright, 1830–1875, believed in the evolution of consciousness and human morality. Fiske was best known as an historian for his two-volume The American Revolution, 1891. Wright was an empiricist philosopher of science who opposed transcendentalism and was to be influential in subsequent pragmatist thought, although he himself published very little. Lester Ward, 1841–1912, was a sociologist best known for dynamic sociology. 1883, but his main ideas in favor of intervention in social evolutionary processes proved to be relevant for future social and political philosophy.
Who was Hannah Arendt?
Hannah Arendt, 1906–1975, was a German-American social and political philosopher who taught at the New School after World War II. She attended the University of Marburg, where she began the affair with Martin Heidegger. 1889–1976, that was to become a lifelong relationship. They broke up and came together repeatedly. Arendt wrote her dissertation on St. Augustine with Karl Jaspers, 1883–1969, at Heidelberg University. She was married to the philosopher Gunther Enders, 1902–1992, in 1929, but they divorced in 1937. She was not allowed to continue her habilitation because she was a Jew. After beginning an investigation on anti-Semitism, she was questioned by the Gestapo. She then went to France, and worked with Walter Benjamin, 1892–1940, in helping Jewish refugees. Her own imprisonment at Camp Gurs ended with her escape. In 1940 Arendt married Heinrich Blücher, 1899–1970, a poet, philosopher, and former communist. With Blücher and her mother, she escaped to the United States from Vichy, France on phony visas, with the assistance of Hiram Bingham IV, an American diplomat. After World War II, Arendt testified for Heidegger in a denazification hearing, and she wrote an admiring essay about his work in a philosophical celebration of his 80th birthday. Arendt was director of research for the Commission of European Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, which led to frequent returns to Germany after 1944. In the United States she taught at the University of California at Berkeley, Princeton University, Northwestern University, and the New School. She was not particularly progressive in the American social context, supporting racial segregation at the beginning of the civil rights movement, and refusing to be identified as a feminist during the period of women's liberation. Her main works are The Origins of Totalitarianism, 1951, The Human Condition, 1958. On Revolution, 1963, On Violence, 1970, Eichmann in Jerusalem, 1963, and The Life of the Mind, 1978.
What were Josiah Royce's ethical and religious views?
The primary virtue according to Royce was loyalty to loyalty. While some people are loyal to bad causes, only good causes could support the loyalty to themselves that constituted loyalty to loyalty. In Royce's interpretation of Christianity, the Church, sin, and atonement were united by God as Spirit. Royce's idea of the role of God as Spirit, in community, was perceived as addressing a neglected aspect of the doctrine of the Trinity. Christian religious history, in emphasizing God and Jesus, had often minimized the Holy Spirit. Although it should be noted that his emphasis on community is similar to Martin Buber's 1878 to 1965 description of how Judaism differs from Christianity.
Who was Jane Addams?
Jane Addams, 1860 to 1935, was the first woman public intellectual in the United States. She was a close colleague of both John Dewey, 1859 to 1952, and George Herbert Mead, 1863 to 1931. In 1931, Addams was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for her progressive public activities in beginning the settlement house movement. The settlement movement involved locating places for assisting members of impoverished immigrant communities, directly in their neighborhoods. Addams began the services of Hull House with art appreciation classes and quickly developed a program of education for youth. Child care, instruction in domestic skills, and adult education. She was only recovered as a philosopher and feminist in the late 20th century. Her main works include Democracy and Social Ethics, 1902, Newer Ideals of Peace, 1906, 20 Years at Hull House, 1910, and Second 20 Years at Hull House, 1930. The Long Road of Woman's Memory, 1916, and Peace and Bread in Time of War, 1922.
Did all 19th century thinkers believe in progress?
Thomas Edison, 1847 to 1931, certainly did. In 1876, when he set up his laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey, he committed himself to a minor invention every 10 days and a big thing every 6 months or so. Edison did get about 40 patents a year and over 1,000 before he died. Not everyone was so enthusiastic about new machines, though. Thomas Carlyle, 1795 to 1881, for example, wrote in 1829 in Signs of the Times, an essay that was published in the Edinburgh Review. The signs being the age of machinery. That the shadow we have wantonly evoked stands terrible before us and will not depart at our bidding. Henry David Thoreau, 1817–1862, wrote in Walden, 1854. We do not ride upon the railroad, it rides upon us. Still, many did share Edison's optimism, and it was the popular national view. Timothy Walker, a lawyer from Ohio, wrote in the North American Review in 1831 that machines free ordinary people from burdensome labor and promote democracy.
Who was Antonio Gramsci?
While Antonio Gramsci, 1891–1937, was in prison, he worked out his version of Marxism, which was mainly a revolt against Karl Marx's, 1818–1883, historical determinism. Gramsci's prison notebooks, compiled after his death, beginning in 1971, was edited for publication by Palmiro Togliatti, who succeeded him as leader of the Italian Communists. According to Togliatti, education and persuasion were the paths to reform toward a classless society. Rather than Bolshevism or direct political revolution. Gramsci's most influential idea has been what Togliatti called Gramsci's theory of hegemony, whereby the dominant class in society creates not only its own ideology, but also that of the classes dominated by it. All classes share the ideology of the dominant class. Hence, education and persuasion are important to change the social mass mind, so that political change can evolve. In this sense, it could be said that Gramsci was not only a member in spirit of the Frankfurt School, he was also a structuralist.
Who was John Dewey?
John Dewey, 1859–1952, was the most famous philosopher in the United States during the early 20th century. He was a public intellectual during the decades when ordinary people, as well as intellectuals, filled halls to hear intellectually stimulating and edifying speeches. His interactive, pragmatic approach to ordinary life, education, and art appreciation has shaped American experience in fundamental ways that do not always refer to him by name. Although, or because, Dewey was shy, he wrote 37 books and more than 700 articles. His main publications include Psychology, 1887, Human Nature and Conduct, 1922, Experience and Nature, 1925, The Public and Its Problems, 1927, The Quest for Certainty, 1929, Philosophy and Civilization, 1932, A Common Faith, 1934, Art as Experience, 1934, Liberalism and Social Action, 1935, Logic, The Theory of Inquiry, 1938, Freedom and Culture, 1939, and Problems of Men, 1946.
What was the dial?
The name for this publication was suggested by Amos Bronson Alcott. 1799 to 1888, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803 to 1882. The simile was explained in the first issue this way. And so with diligent hands and good intent we set down our dial on the earth. We wish it may resemble that instrument in its celebrated happiness, that of measuring no hours but those of sunshine. Let it be one cheerful rational voice amidst the din of mourners and polemics. Or to abide by our chosen image, let it be such a dial, not as the dead face of a clock. Hardly even such as the gnomon in a garden, but rather such a dial as is the garden itself, in whose leaves and flowers the suddenly awakened sleeper is instantly apprised not what part of dead time, but what state of life and growth is now arrived and arriving. The dial became dormant in 1844, but was revived for a year in 1860. In 1880 it reappeared as a political magazine, and in 1920 as a literary modernist magazine, publishing essays, poetry, and art reviews until 1929.
Who was Herbert Marcuse?
Herbert Marcuse, 1898 to 1979, generally inspired left-wing thought in the United States after he was exiled from Germany in 1933. He was, for example, African-American political activist Angela Davis' dissertation advisor. And Abbie Hoffman, one of the radical founders of the New Left, studied with him as well. Marcuse's primary theme was that philosophy is necessary to combat political oppression. He drew on Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900, and Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939. To criticize Marxism for its underlying Enlightenment faith in reason. He thought that Western democracies, as well as communist regimes, used scientific methods to deprive people of freedom through mass education and the trivialization of culture into entertainment. His major theme was the ways in which political repression was mirrored in psychosexual repression. His main works include Reason and Revolution, 1941, Eros and Civilization, 1955, One-Dimensional Man, 1964, and Critique of Pure Tolerance, 1969.
Did John Dewey hold views on education for children?
Yes, and some have considered this unusual in a philosopher. He was married twice and had 6 children himself and adopted 3. Although Dewey did not want to be known as an educator, because it would detract from his philosophical reputation, his contribution to education was at least as lasting as his philosophical innovations. When Dewey began to consider education, school children were expected to sit quietly and absorb information passively. while Dewey did not believe in a completely child-centered method of instruction. He emphasized the activity of learning, with an understanding that children are already curious and energetic participants in common, ordinary life outside the classroom. Dewey thought that children should be taught skills to solve problems, including moral problems. When he became chair of the Department of Philosophy, Psychology, and Education at the University of Chicago, he founded the Laboratory School. It was based on his theory of education, the motto of which was "Learn by doing." However, he acknowledged practical advice from Ella Flagg Young, the first woman president of the National Education Association, who was able to translate his ideas into actual practices and exercises in the classroom. He was also in contact with Jane Addams, who had co-founded the educational mission at Hull House. Dewey spent considerable time there himself, talking to working people about their problems and aspirations. His 1899 The School and Society was a bestseller. Dewey's subsequent works on education were The Child and the Curriculum, 1902, How We Think, 1910, and Democracy and Education, 1916.
Was social Darwinism a beneficial set of beliefs?
Most progressives thought not. First, social Darwinism tended to accept, if not applaud, the suffering of the poor, as though it reflected their personal weakness rather than the structure of society. And second, social Darwinism evolved into a reactionary type of white supremacy. Toward the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, social Darwinism and its associated eugenics merged with white American racialist beliefs that would later be considered racist or discriminatory. For example, in 1916 amateur anthropologist and lawyer Madison Grant published The Passing of the Great Race, or The Racial Basis of European History. Grant propounded a theory of Nordic superiority and argued for a public eugenic program to save the Nordics from being overrun by non-white racial groups. Grant's book sold 1,600,000 copies by 1937. It was widely influential in individual beliefs and public policy that restricted immigration from Asia and discriminated harshly against African Americans.
What are some facts about Maurice Merleau-Ponty's life and career?
Merleau-Ponty's father was killed in World War I. He completed his philosophical studies at the École Normale Supérieure in 1930 and then taught in high schools throughout France. He wrote 2 dissertations for his doctorate and was given the chair of child psychology at the Sorbonne in 1949. Next, he was made chair of philosophy at the Collège de France in 1952. With Jean-Paul Sartre. 1905 to 1980, he founded the journal Les Temps Modernes. But he resigned from the publication as editor, partly in objection to Sartre's subject-object dichotomy. Merleau-Ponty wrote about their dispute in Adventures of the Dialectic, 1955. Overall, Merleau-Ponty opposed dualisms and he also criticized self versus world ideas. He thought that the self was as much a body as a mind and that our bodies are always in the world.
Who were the main social Darwinists?
William Graham Sumner, 1840–1910, professor at Yale, was the American version of the English evolutionist Herbert Spencer, 1820–1903. Sumner was a strong advocate of unrestricted capitalism. He was famous for his essay The Man of Virtue, which promoted self-interest as a primary duty for individuals. The industrialist Andrew Carnegie, 1835–1919, built on these ideas in his The Gospel of Wealth, which further enshrined the law of competition as a natural principle of progress.
Who was Charles Sanders Peirce?
Charles Sanders Peirce, 1839–1914, is recognized as the founder and originator of pragmatism. Although his intellectual expertise extended to logic, mathematics, economics, social science, the physical sciences, and geodesic work, Peirce's published writings date from 1857 until his death and constitute 12,000 printed pages. There are, in addition, 80,000 pages of his unpublished handwritten work. His principal works, published posthumously, are edited volumes, such as The New Elements of Mathematics. 4 volumes, 1976, The Essential Pairs, 2 volumes, 1992 and 1998, and Writings of Charles S. Peirce, a chronological edition, 5 volumes, 1882–1993.
What was John Dewey's theory of art?
First, Dewey thought that inquiry is an art, and he rejected what he called the spectator theory of knowledge, whereby knowing is believed to be passive contemplation. According to Dewey, ordinary human life itself is a form of art, because it is permeated with aesthetic qualities in human experience. For Dewey, all experience, or anything that can be called an experience, has an aesthetic quality that can be directly appreciated. An experience has an immediacy that is directly felt or had and which unites its constituents into the same whole. Dewey meant by this that we are not aware of the physical or chemical aspects of our experience but of holistic actions and qualities. For example, the runner does not experience her sprained ankle in the same way that the sports doctor examining her does. She has a united qualitative experience of strain and pain. Whereas the sports doctor understands her condition in terms of which exact tissues have been damaged. Dewey called the aesthetic qualities of experience tertiary qualities. Because experience is a kind of transaction. The aesthetic quality of an experience can change and become more meaningful toward a consummation. A consummation is the reconstruction of an experience by intelligence, for example, solving a problem. What is not aesthetic according to Dewey is what is slack or overly rigid. There is nothing in either scientific inquiry or practical action that precludes the presence of aesthetic qualities.
What are some key facts about John Dewey's life and career?
Dewey was born in 1859 in Burlington, Vermont, where his father was a grocer. He attended the University of Vermont and then taught classics, science, and algebra at a high school in Oil City, Pennsylvania, and then in Burlington, Vermont. Unsure of his future direction, but encouraged by former teachers, he applied to the new graduate program in philosophy at Johns Hopkins University but was turned down for a fellowship twice. Dewey finally borrowed $500 from an aunt to attend. He thereby became part of the first generation able to obtain PhDs in philosophy in the United States. Dewey's teachers at Johns Hopkins were philosophers George Sylvester Morris (1840–1889) and Charles Sanders Peirce (1839–1914), and psychologist G. Stanley Hall (1844–1924). At first, Dewey was very interested in Hegelian ideas of organism, that the living being interacts with its environment, and that society is an organic whole that can be viewed as an organism. After writing a dissertation on Immanuel Kant, 1724–1804, he taught at the University of Michigan from 1884 to 1894. At this time he became interested in public education and progressive politics, as well as psychology. In 1894 Dewey became chair of the Department of Philosophy, Psychology, and Education at the University of Chicago. At Chicago, working with colleagues, he began to develop activist social theories. This resulted in the 1903 Studies in Logical Theory, which was dedicated to William James, 1842–1910. Dewey had a national reputation when he left Chicago for Columbia University. The Journal of Philosophy, published by the Columbia Philosophy Department, became an outlet for his ideas and a forum for discussion of them over the decades. Dewey lectured in Tokyo, Peking, and Nanking, and studied education in Turkey, Mexico, and Russia. In retirement, Dewey chaired the 1937 Mexican Commission investigating charges against Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky, which produced a report, "Not Guilty." He also defended Bertrand Russell in 1941, when Russell was denied a teaching opportunity at City College, New York, because of his political ideas.
What is pragmatism?
Pragmatism is a distinctively American philosophy that originated in community discussion groups and came to define the philosophy department at Harvard University during the late 19th century. While not as scientific in perspective as some philosophy in Europe during the same time, it represented an effort to think in a practical way.
What was Hannah Arendt's political philosophy?
Overall, Arendt was a strong critic of totalitarianism and an advocate of individual freedom, offering distinctive insights. She believed that both fascism and communism arose under illusions of inevitability based on the lack of real political community in modern life. She did not consider herself an existentialist because she thought, "We are" is a more important starting point for philosophy than "I am." Her positive model of society was active citizen participation in ways that leave social and private interests out of civic identities. Arendt's analysis of the trial of the Nazi Adolf Eichmann, in which she introduced the concept of the banality of evil, was very controversial for her criticism of how Eichmann's trial was conducted in Israel, and how Jewish leaders had behaved under German dictator Adolf Hitler. Arendt's last work was an examination of practical judgment in political contexts, in which she used the figure of Socrates, 460 to 399 BCE, to posit inner dialogues. Conscience, she said, had the role of supporting friendship with oneself.
Was 19th century evolutionary thought connected to ideas of progress?
Not directly, because evolution was an external force, whereas progress depended on individual human effort. But the two notions were frequently associated, as in the ideas of American industrialist Andrew Carnegie. In general, notions of progress formed both ideals and practical motivations. Society as a whole was believed to be progressing, and individuals were motivated to advance in life by becoming materially prosperous. The prosperity of society was largely believed to be a matter of technology. The 19th century was the first full-fledged machine age, and it saw the inventions and wide use of the cotton gin, locomotive, telegraph, and electric lights, to name just a few.
What are some key facts about Charles Peirce's career and life?
Charles Sanders Peirce, 1839 to 1914, was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts. His father, Benjamin, was professor of mathematics at Harvard University and A founder of the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey and the Smithsonian Institution. Benjamin Pierce is also said to have built the Harvard Department of Mathematics. At the age of 12, young Charles discovered logic, and at 16, he began his independent study of philosophy. In 1859 he graduated from Harvard, unsure of what I would do in life. His primary interest was in logic, for which there were no career opportunities. He practiced geodesy for several years and returned to Harvard to study natural history and philosophy in 1861. He got a Ph.D. in chemistry in 1863, graduating summa cum laude. Pierce continued his studies of logic on his own and has been considered to be one of the greatest logicians of all times. Although he disagreed with Immanuel Kant's 1724–1804 insistence that space was Euclidean and later moved to Friedrich Hegel's 1770–1831 objective idealism, Kant remained a dominating influence over his philosophical ideas. Pierce's philosophy was a distinct form of pragmatism, which he called pragmaticism.
Who was Frederick Douglass?
Many contemporary scholars of race consider Frederick Douglass, born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, 1818–1895, to be the first liberatory African-American intellectual. In 1873, he was the vice presidential candidate when Victoria Woodhull was the first woman to run for U.S. president. Douglass began life as a slave, but was taught to read at the age of 12 by his owner's sister-in-law. He taught other slaves to read, and after a series of failed escapes he finally gained his freedom and became active in the Massachusetts anti-slavery movement. At 23 he began his distinguished and inspiring career of public speaking. He was present at the Seneca Falls Convention, where the American suffragist movement originated in 1848. Douglass toured Ireland and England in the mid-1840s, and his supporters raised money to legally purchase his freedom in 1856. Back in the United States, Douglass published newspapers, the most famous of which was the North Star, which had as the motto "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color, God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren." In the 1850s, Douglass spoke for school desegregation in New York. During the U.S. Civil War, he promoted the rights of blacks to fight for the Union. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1862, he said, "We were waiting and listening as for a bolt from the sky, we were watching, by the dim light of the stars for the dawn of a new day, we were longing for the answer to the agonizing prayers of centuries." In 1884, after his first wife had died, Douglass married Helen Pitts, a white suffragist from New York. Pitts had worked on Alpha, the 19th-century radical women's publication. While living in Washington, D.C., Douglass' main writings are a narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, 1845, The Heroic Slave, Autographs for Freedom, 1853. My Bondage and My Freedom, 1855, and Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, 1881, revised, 1892. He edited the North Star from 1847 to 1851, after which it became the Frederick Douglass paper.
What was social Darwinism?
Social Darwinism was an application of the Darwinian idea of the survival of the fittest to inequalities and opportunities in contemporary 19th century society. It was an age in which the enterprising could amass large fortunes in a short period of time. Although they had to compete with other capitalists. And those who labored, often in unhealthy and exhausting conditions for barely enough pay to support themselves, also competed among themselves for available jobs. Social Darwinists wrote popular books, sometimes consisting of what today would be considered racist or class-based eugenics. And their claims made a strong impression on general readers. They shared a belief that competition was valuable in itself and that those who failed in life's contests failed a deeper test of evolutionary survival. Instead of social reform, their ideals were to encourage the traits that enabled success at competition by means of selective human breeding, as well as moral approval of the winners.
What was evolutionary thought like in America during the 19th century?
Within educated communities, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was broadly accepted as an accurate history of living beings. Since deism, or the idea that God was suffused throughout nature, was a widespread perspective at the time. There was not an obvious conflict between religious accounts of creation and evolution. Discussion more commonly centered on whether social forms of evolution were ruthlessly competitive or cooperative. As in 19th century European thought, there were two perspectives: life in society, as in nature, was red in tooth and claw and a matter of survival of the fittest. Or, life in society, as in nature, evolved through cooperation. It is not surprising that the transcendentalists favored the cooperative view.
What is the difference between critical theory and structuralism?
There is no clear distinction of practice that practitioners of both schools of thought would accept. Many structuralists denied being structuralists, and some critical theorists were unaware of the term critical theory. But from the standpoint of a reader, it may help to keep in mind that both structuralism and critical theory provide analyses of society that need not be accepted by the members of society being analyzed. The term critical theory is associated with the Frankfurt School. which developed the 20th century version of scholarly Marxism. The term structuralism refers to a study of mental structures in society. Critical theory seeks to provide analyses that further progressive and egalitarian social goal. Structuralism also uses critical theory. Although the members and followers of the Frankfurt School were not narrowly political, their Marxist legacy tended to point them in certain political directions. While structuralists might have shared certain goals with Marxian critical theorists, their subjects were other social institutions besides government. They also took up Freudian psychology and were instrumental in laying the foundations for a new focus on language and symbols as an important philosophical subject. In some quarters, given the successors or intellectual heirs of structuralism, language and the symbolic order became the only intellectual subject. That is, the structuralists paved the way for intellectual postmodernism, which is also known as post-structuralism.
Who is Angela Davis?
Angela Davis, 1944, is a world-famous African-American social critic and political activist. In 1970, she was acting assistant professor in the philosophy department at the University of California, Los Angeles, and a member of the Communist Party USA. She was also once associated with the Black Panther Party. Davis was criminally indicted for helping Black Panther member George Jackson to escape from a courtroom in Marin County, California, in 1970. The guns Jackson used were registered in Angela Davis' name. She was for a while on the FBI's most wanted list after she fled arrest. In the end, Davis was acquitted of criminal charges and was rehired at the university. Davis claimed that she never completed her dissertation because it was lost in papers confiscated by the FBI. She has since developed a distinguished career in critical writings about race and gender as well as the prison industrial complex in contemporary American culture. Davis' principal works include If They Come in the Morning, Voices of Resistance, 1971. Frame Up, The Opening Defense Statement Made, 1972, Angela Davis, An Autobiography. 1974, Women, Race and Class, 1981, Violence Against Women and the Ongoing Challenge to Racism. 1985, Women, Culture and Politics, 1989, Blues Legacies and Black Feminism. Gertrude Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, and Billie Holiday, 1999, Are Prisons Obsolete? 2003, An Abolition Democracy, Beyond Prisons, Torture, and Empire, 2005.
Who was Josiah Royce?
Josiah Royce, 1855 to 1916, is known as an absolute pragmatist. He sought to combine German and British absolute idealism with American pragmatism. Royce was born in Grass Valley, California, which, at the time following the gold rush, was a mining town. His family moved to San Francisco when he was 11 and he graduated from the University of California in 1875. He then received a PhD from Johns Hopkins University in 1878. Royce also studied at universities in Leipzig and Göttingen, after which he taught English at the University of California for 4 years. In 1882, he was invited to join Harvard's philosophy department, where he eventually became a professor and led a highly acclaimed and distinguished career. Royce's major publications are The World and the Individual, 1899. Sources of Religious Insight, 1912, The Problem of Christianity, 1913, War and Insurance, 1914. The Hope of the Great Community, 1916, and Lectures on Modern Idealism, 1919. Also available is Royce's Logical Essays, Collected Logical Essays of Josiah Royce, 1951.
What are some highlights of Jane Addams' life that led her to found Hull House?
Addams' father was a mill owner and politician in Cedarville, Illinois. Her mother died when she was 2, while giving birth to her 9th child. Addams attended Rockford Seminary, a women's college, failed in medical school, and became depressed for a decade, during which she traveled throughout Europe. Along the way she visited London's Toynbee Hall, which was a young men's community that helped poor Jewish and Irish immigrants in East London by working within these people's neighborhoods. Addams resolved to duplicate this plan, and in 1889 she founded Hull House in the near West Side community of Chicago. Hull House was run and operated by women. Addams had long-term relationships with her co-founder and college friend, Ellen Gates Starr, and, later on, with her colleague Mary Rosette Smith. Addams' work at Hull House, and other settlement houses based on it, made her well known. She became a very popular public speaker. She was involved in the founding of other progressive organizations, such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the American Civil Liberties Union, and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Former President Theodore Roosevelt asked her to second his nomination for the presidency by the Bull Moose Progressive Party in 1912. Roosevelt had served 3 years as U.S. President after 1901, and a full term after 1904. The Progressive Party strongly supported women's rights and suffrage. However, Addams became a target for intense public criticism when she expressed both pacifist and feminist views before World War I. Toward the end of her life, she dedicated herself to world peace and African American civil rights.
What did Maurice Merleau-Ponty mean by a phenomenology of perception?
Merleau-Ponty opposed the abstract natures of both empiricism, which generalized, and idealism, which denied the direct experience and existence of physical reality. He proclaimed that the perceiving mind is an incarnate mind, meaning that it was in the body in the sense of being coincident with the body. Perception is a physical process involving eyes, ears, the nose, the hands, rather than only the mind. His focus was thus on the human body as a perceiving, living part of world. A position theretofore much neglected in philosophical inquiry. According to Merleau-Ponty, perception is neither abstract nor scientific. Rather, all perception is lived, it is the experience of human beings in the world. Consciousness is, to use a later term, embodied and always engaged in perceiving the world. What is phenomenological about human experience is that what is perceived cannot be separated from how it is perceived or from how it is described. In conversation with Ferdinand de Saussure, 1857–1913, Merleau-Ponty composed the prose of the world. 1969, claiming that meaning is not determined by history but by the subject's actual experience in the world. Language is itself continually changing as a result of this experience. In The Visible and the Invisible, Merleau-Ponty had intended to show how communication and thought can go beyond perception, but he died before completing that project.
What was the Frankfurt School?
The Frankfurt School was the intellectual activity associated with the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt am Main, Germany. The institute was made possible by a gift from Felix Weil. 1898–1975, in 1923, following the first Marxist week, which was very well received by intellectuals. The institute was, in addition, funded by Frankfurt University and, during the Nazi period, 1933–1944. Max Horkheimer, 1895–1973, and Theodor Adorno, 1903–1969, secured the support of Columbia University to set up its exiled version as the International Institute of Social Research in New York City. The institute in Frankfurt was reinstated after World War II ended in 1945. Walter Benjamin, 1892–1940. Herbert Marcuse, 1898–1979, and Erich Fromm, 1900–1980, were also among its first generation of members. Jürgen Habermas, 1923, remains its most famous contemporary member. Hannah Arendt, 1906–1975, had political interests that implied she had more in common with the Frankfurt School than any other movement. Despite striking out on her own as an American philosopher after leaving Germany. Although not part of the Frankfurt School because he was imprisoned by the Italian fascist government in 1926, the Marxist theorist Antonio Gramsci, 1891–1937, deserves mention in this context.
What was John Dewey's metaphysics?
Dewey held that nature has different transactions, or kinds of action, that have mutual causes and effects between or among their components. Dewey's transactions are thus interactions. There are three evolutionary levels, or plateaus, of transactions: physiochemical, psychophysical, and human experience. Physiochemical reactions are simply what can be studied by physics and chemistry. Psychophysical transactions are connections between mind and body. Human experience is exactly how things seem to human beings as they go about their lives.
How did William James express his own will to believe?
In the 1880s, James wanted to apply scientific methodology to mind reading and spiritualism. He could not find collaborators in the Harvard academic community. But in England at that time both Alfred Russel Wallace, who had discovered the theory of evolution at the same time as Charles Darwin, and the moral philosopher Henry Sidgwick, 1838 to 1900, and his wife, Nora, were already interested in subjects of this sort. James became part of a group of intellectuals who went to seances and carefully investigated reports of supernatural events. They also counted reports of apparitions that occurred on the same day the person whose apparition appeared, had died. This so-called census of hallucinations resulted in a statistically significant correlation between day of death and appearance of that person's ghost. However, James thought that the sample of 17,000 would have yielded more reliable results if it were 50,000 and included American as well as British apparitions. James was also very skeptical of the table rapping and spirit-directed writing that were routine at seances. And he wanted to exclude mediums from the ranks of reputable spiritual researchers.
Who was Walter Benjamin?
Walter Benjamin, 1892 to 1940. Is highly regarded for the ways in which he combined Jewish religious insights with Marxism. He died from taking morphine pills in Purtbu on the French-Spanish border, while traveling with a group of intellectuals escaping from the Nazis. Different theories have been advanced about his death. That he committed suicide to avoid torture by the Gestapo for himself and his colleagues, or that Stalinists killed him. Benjamin was Hannah Arendt's, 1906 to 1975, first husband's cousin. Before he died he gave Arendt the manuscript to his The Concept of History, 1939, which she gave to Theodor Adorno, 1903 to 1969, who had it published in the United States. In his major work The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, 1936, he combined Jewish mysticism with Marxism. Benjamin thought that logic was limited as a philosophical tool because in modern times the philosophical is best accessed through literature and music. He was studied mainly for his theories in musicology. Until his work was recognized to be highly relevant for postmodernism in the late 20th century.
What were some of Josiah Royce's metaphysical ideas?
Royce's metaphysical system was intended to solve the problems posed by a religious worldview. He believed that what exists is a totality of everything that is known, so that the nature of being can be understood by understanding how it comes to be known. Although knowledge starts with data from the senses, to arrive at the idea of a public object, as well as a past and future, transcendence is necessary. Transcendental judgment is not isolated, but part of a system of judgments. Such a system can account for error as a failure to define an object. An idea is a purpose that seeks an object, but the object in turn clarifies the original idea. The infinite is real, because the absolute, which is one, represents itself along with everything else that mirrors it.
What was ironic about Maurice Merleau-Ponty's last lecture?
Merleau-Ponty died suddenly of a stroke while preparing to give a lecture on René Descartes, 1596–1650. He repeatedly returned to Descartes' split between the mind and the body in composing his own philosophy. He did not accept the Cartesian split, but sought to address the mind and body as a united whole. Merleau-Ponty thought that a person's own body, le corps propre, should be in its personal, individual, lived reality, a scientific subject. It is one's own body that makes consciousness corporeal. He wrote, "Insofar as I have hands, feet, a body, I sustain around me intentions which are not dependent on my decisions and which affect my surroundings in a way that I do not choose." Clearly, Merleau-Ponty's stroke proves this point because it was not something he chose, but definitely something that conclusively affected not only his surroundings but the possibility of his even having those surroundings. What's ironic is that he made his point by having a stroke, which is very different from making a philosophical argument.
What were John Dewey's main philosophical ideas?
Dewey brought ordinary life into philosophy. His main concept was experience, first for a cognitive Hegelian subject, and later as a more inclusive emotional and active dimension of human life. Dewey argued, against philosophical idealists and indeed most other philosophers of his day, that most of what is important in our experience is not reflective. Unlike the Hegelians, he also insisted that there was not a unified whole of all experience. but many interlocking versions or kinds of experience. Experience, for Dewey, was thus pluralistic. But the experience of the concrete human individual, or the real person, was the primary form of experience for Dewey. Dewey sought to articulate the anthropological and biological nature of lived human experience. He saw this as a new form of empiricism. Against criticism that he was neglecting what was objective in writing and speaking as though experience was everything, Dewey developed a metaphysical account of experience.
Who were Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno?
Max Horkheimer, 1893–1973, and Theodor Adorno, 1903–1969. Were founding members of the Frankfurt School, and they were its leaders in exile. Horkheimer was a cultural critic and social philosopher. Adorno was a cultural critic and musicologist. Horkheimer's ideal was a general understanding of the place of human beings in society. He thought, contrary to orthodox Marxists who often viewed society from the standpoint of the proletariat, that no social class at that time escaped distortions in its social worldview. Adorno thought that Austrian composer Arnold Schoenberg's atonal music supported human autonomy or freedom, and he strongly condemned jazz as a form of music for the masses, in contrast. In a way, given their shared view that Marxism should not be culturally centered on the proletariat, it is not surprising that Horkheimer and Adorno collaborated, producing Dialectic of Enlightenment, 1974. They argued that the progress sought in the Enlightenment could not be achieved, and that instead the result would be either mass capitalistic vulgarity in a consumer economy, or totalitarian brutality.
How did Hull House fulfill pragmatist ideals of knowledge?
Adams saw Hull House as an epistemological, theory of knowledge, project, as much as a charitable program. She wrote, "The ideal and developed settlement would attempt to test the value of human knowledge by action and realization. Quite as the complete and ideal university would concern itself with the discovery of knowledge in all branches."
How did Hull House fulfill pragmatist ideals of knowledge?
Adams saw Hull House as an epistemological, theory of knowledge, project, as much as a charitable program. She wrote, "The ideal and developed settlement would attempt to test the value of human knowledge by action and realization. Quite as the complete and ideal university would concern itself with the discovery of knowledge in all branches."
Who was George Herbert Mead?
George Herbert Mead, 1863 to 1931, was a philosopher, social theorist, and reformer whom John Dewey, 1859 to 1952, described as a seminal mind of the first order. Dewey brought him to the University of Chicago when he accepted his position there. Mead had been raised in a New England Puritan community, but in his mature thought he became an empiricist. Mead's most important contribution to both pragmatic theories of education and sociology was his idea of symbolic interaction. He offered an explanation of the development of the human mind and self through the development of language and role-playing. Although something of a behaviorist in his insistence on the social nature of individual mental development, Mead also believed that there were different developmental stages of adjustment to the external environment. Mead worked with Dewey in the Chicago Laboratory School and was a friend of Jane Addams. 1860 to 1935, and a close observer of her work at Hull House.
Who was George Herbert Mead?
George Herbert Mead, 1863 to 1931, was a philosopher, social theorist, and reformer whom John Dewey, 1859 to 1952, described as a seminal mind of the first order. Dewey brought him to the University of Chicago when he accepted his position there. Mead had been raised in a New England Puritan community, but in his mature thought he became an empiricist. Mead's most important contribution to both pragmatic theories of education and sociology was his idea of symbolic interaction. He offered an explanation of the development of the human mind and self through the development of language and role-playing. Although something of a behaviorist in his insistence on the social nature of individual mental development, Mead also believed that there were different developmental stages of adjustment to the external environment. Mead worked with Dewey in the Chicago Laboratory School and was a friend of Jane Addams. 1860 to 1935, and a close observer of her work at Hull House.
Who was George Santayana?
George Santayana, born Jorge Agustin Nicolas Ruiz de Santayana y Boraz, 1863 to 1952, was a philosopher, poet, art critic, and author of the international best-selling novel The Last Puritan, 1935, new edition, 1936. His father was Spanish and he was born in Madrid, but his Scottish mother brought him to the United States when he was 9 and enrolled him in the Boston Latin School. In 1889 he received a Ph.D. in philosophy from Harvard, with Josiah Royce, 1855 to 1916, as his advisor. In 1892 he accepted an instructorship at Harvard and later became professor of philosophy, teaching there for 20 years. Santayana's students included authors Conrad Aiken, T.S. Eliot, Robert Frost, Wallace Stevens, and Walter Lippmann, as well as U.S. Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter. Santayana retired from Harvard in 1912 and spent the remainder of his life writing and traveling in Europe. His main publications are The Sense of Beauty, 1896, Interpretations of Poetry and Religion, 1900. The Life of Reason, 5 volumes, 1905 to 1906, Skepticism and Animal Faith, 1923, The Realms of Being. 4 volumes, 1927 to 1940, Persons and Places, 1944, The Middle Span, 1945, and My Host the World, 1953. In addition to numerous other books and essays. Santayana's published correspondence to over 350 respondents runs to 8 volumes.
Who was George Santayana?
George Santayana, born Jorge Agustin Nicolas Ruiz de Santayana y Boraz, 1863 to 1952, was a philosopher, poet, art critic, and author of the international best-selling novel The Last Puritan, 1935, new edition, 1936. His father was Spanish and he was born in Madrid, but his Scottish mother brought him to the United States when he was 9 and enrolled him in the Boston Latin School. In 1889 he received a Ph.D. in philosophy from Harvard, with Josiah Royce, 1855 to 1916, as his advisor. In 1892 he accepted an instructorship at Harvard and later became professor of philosophy, teaching there for 20 years. Santayana's students included authors Conrad Aiken, T.S. Eliot, Robert Frost, Wallace Stevens, and Walter Lippmann, as well as U.S. Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter. Santayana retired from Harvard in 1912 and spent the remainder of his life writing and traveling in Europe. His main publications are The Sense of Beauty, 1896, Interpretations of Poetry and Religion, 1900. The Life of Reason, 5 volumes, 1905 to 1906, Skepticism and Animal Faith, 1923, The Realms of Being. 4 volumes, 1927 to 1940, Persons and Places, 1944, The Middle Span, 1945, and My Host the World, 1953. In addition to numerous other books and essays. Santayana's published correspondence to over 350 respondents runs to 8 volumes.
What did George Herbert Mead contribute to philosophy?
Mead was a philosopher of emergence, in his studies of Darwinian evolution. He proposed that new forms of life change the nature of the past. Because after a new form exists, what preceded and led to it needs to be reinterpreted. Mead did not publish while he lived. Although his works were prepared by his students to appear posthumously as Mind, Self, and Society, 1934.
What did George Herbert Mead contribute to philosophy?
Mead was a philosopher of emergence, in his studies of Darwinian evolution. He proposed that new forms of life change the nature of the past. Because after a new form exists, what preceded and led to it needs to be reinterpreted. Mead did not publish while he lived. Although his works were prepared by his students to appear posthumously as Mind, Self, and Society, 1934.
What was George Santayana's contribution to pragmatism?
Other than the fact that Josiah Royce, 1855 to 1916, was his teacher and C. I. Lewis, 1883 to 1964, argued against his intuitive theory of knowledge. It is not always clear how Santayana was a pragmatist. The philosophical convention places him within that group. Mostly due to time and place and the pragmatist philosophers he interacted with while living in the United States. Still, Santayana's ideas about aesthetics, reason, philosophy itself, and human nature share a common spirit with William James, 1842 to 1910, and John Dewey, 1859 to 1952. Santayana's theory of aesthetics was that beauty is the experience of pleasure in the form of an object, rather than the effects on the sense organs of the person experiencing the artwork. He claimed that all preference is basically irrational and that values are based on pleasure. His take on reason emphasized human creativity in science, religion, society, and ordinary life, as well as more obviously in art. Overall, he identified human beings as animals, inhabiting a physical world, oriented toward food, and fearful of danger. Santayana thought that nature was a kind of backdrop within which we have our experience. In The Life of Reason, 1905 to 1906, he described nature as drawn like a sponge, heavy and dripping from the waters of sentience. The nature of nature is thus conditioned by our experience of it. These views characterize his early work. After he left Harvard, Santayana wrote about metaphysics and ontology, emphasizing objective reality as opposed to human experience. But Santayana himself did not acknowledge this change in his subject matter, and in his later writing he claimed to be providing a more comprehensive and rigorous foundation for his earlier theories of art and experience.
What was George Santayana's contribution to pragmatism?
Other than the fact that Josiah Royce, 1855 to 1916, was his teacher and C. I. Lewis, 1883 to 1964, argued against his intuitive theory of knowledge. It is not always clear how Santayana was a pragmatist. The philosophical convention places him within that group. mostly due to time and place and the pragmatist philosophers he interacted with while living in the United States. Still, Santayana's ideas about aesthetics, reason, philosophy itself, and human nature share a common spirit with William James, 1842–1910, and John Dewey, 1859–1952. Santayana's theory of aesthetics was that beauty is the experience of pleasure in the form of an object, rather than the effects on the sense organs of the person experiencing the artwork. He claimed that all preference is basically irrational and that values are based on pleasure. His take on reason emphasized human creativity in science, religion, society, and ordinary life, as well as more obviously in art. Overall, he identified human beings as animals, inhabiting a physical world, oriented toward food, and fearful of danger. Santayana thought that nature was a kind of backdrop within which we have our experience. In The Life of Reason, 1905–1906, he described nature as drawn like a sponge, heavy and dripping from the waters of sentience. The nature of nature is thus conditioned by our experience of it. These views characterize his early work. After he left Harvard, Santayana wrote about metaphysics and ontology, emphasizing objective reality as opposed to human experience. But Santayana himself did not acknowledge this change in his subject matter, and in his later writing he claimed to be providing a more comprehensive and rigorous foundation for his earlier theories of art and experience.